Welcome to Unlocked. I'm Dr. Joel Swakowski. In this show, we explore how truth comes to life through real stories and real people. Today, I am joined by John Lenhart, otherwise known as J.G. Lenhart. He's a friend of mine I've known for going on 19 years, and he's also an author, a modeler, and yeah, one of the most interesting men I've ever met. He's going to be a frequent collaborator with me on the Unlocked show. So I wanted to have him on the very first episode so that you all could get a better understanding of who this guy is and what his background is. And yeah, there's a lot in his story that we couldn't unpack in this first episode, but it's a great overview and it's a great starting point. So I imagine I'll have him on quite a bit and we'll be able to unpack some of the nuance and some of the stuff that we weren't able to hit today. But I really do hope you enjoy the interview I had with him. I thought it went great. Very interesting. And yeah, I'm excited for you all to hear his story. So let's dive in. All right. Thank you, John, for being here on this show. So you and I have known each other. It's actually going on 19 years. I think in October it'll be 19 years since I met you. It was 20 or 2006. And I remember at the time, Modeling God hadn't been published yet, but the manuscript was pretty much in its final forms, right? It was only 8, 9 months later that you published it. I know there's quite the backstory to this whole thing, though. I met you when this thing was pretty much fully formed. And yeah, this was a project that was a passion project for you for years before. So I'd love to hear the background to this entire story that I know about you.
Yeah, well, it's not something that happened overnight. So just to help people familiarize themselves with me, I've been a Christian 44 years. I went to college to get a degree in chemistry and chemical engineering. And I think that really set me up for modeling God because chemistry is very philosophical. Nothing's 100% and nothing's 0%. It's very theoretical. You can't actually touch the molecules and move them around. So chemistry is very philosophical. Engineering, it's very much it's modeling and it's very definite. There isn't anything theoretical about engineering. You design something, you make it, and a gear flies off or whatever.
Yeah.
That's a bad news. So it's very objective. So you have the theoretical part and you have the objective part. And that's what kind of propelled me into um, going into these companies where I made consumer products. So I made these detergents, I made all these different products at four different companies. And really, where the story of Modeling God begins is I was at a company that had sold 7 million units of a new product, and seven of them had malfunction. One had burned down an apartment complex, one had burned down a trailer, and they pulled like the 50 best scientists, chemists, technical people into a room and said, hey, we need you to solve this. We need you to stop working on
Yeah.
all your other projects. We need you to work on this. And I was pretty established and pretty accomplished at these other companies that afternoon, I happened to be walking through the tunnel to another building. We had tunnels underground with these buildings. And the vice president of R&D was walking the other way. And he said, John, are we going to be able to solve this thing? And I said, don't worry about it. I have four principles that when used together always result in the truth. I don't know the answer right now, but I know if I use these four principles, I'm going to get to the answer. I said, start worrying about the next biggest problem around here. So that's where this all started is I had, through my other companies, had developed these four principles that could determine truth.
So at this point, well, one, that kind of shows how big of a problem this was. This, this
Oh,
leader in the
it was a
company.
very large problem. This was a privately held company, and the employees got profit sharing twice a year.
Oh,
So one of the profit sharing checks they used to pay for their kids' private schooling, and the other profit sharing check they used to pay for property taxes. So they said we were going to have to put 50 to $100 million aside to deal with nuisance lawsuits. Anytime somebody, because once they announced to the public what the problem was with this product, anybody could say, well, my house burned down because of that product. And
Oh,
then all of a sudden we would have to investigate it. So they said, we won't have 3 profit sharing checks for the next 18 months. There won't, if we don't solve this, there won't be profit sharing checks. So this was a big deal, 50 to $100 million problem. Yeah.
and how old were you at this time?
I was 33.
Wow. And already had been using the four principles enough where you were confidently enough, bold enough to confidently say to this guy, worry about the next problem. I got this.
Right. Well, yeah, this was my 4th company. And at the previous companies, I'd been the youngest inventor. I'd been the youngest inventor of the year at one of the companies. I had introduced products that had taken down the #1 company. So I had used these. I'd kind of gotten this job because of what I had done with these 4 principles at other companies.
Man, mid-30s. Young man, too. All right. At the top of your game.
Right.
Yeah.
So what happened was I ended up using these 4 principles, and within 3 weeks, 2 weeks after we were supposed to solve it, everybody quit except for me. 3 weeks to the day, I got 2 products that malfunction. And
Oh,
these 2
wow.
products shot fire 2 to 3 feet. It was really incredible. So I thought I was going to win this, high technical award that would have come with a big cash bonus and stock in the company for 5 years, private stock for 5 years. And instead, this was 1996. I got 2 tickets to Mission Impossible, which the Mission Impossible first movie was out because I had solved the impossible mission.
How'd you feel about that?
Well, I was happy I'd solved the problem.
Yeah.
I always saw myself as like a Daniel and a Joseph. And I really was like, this is like a Daniel situation. And to do that, I was very happy about that. But I realized it's pretty unfair. But
Yeah.
I realized I had something really powerful here. I had 4 principles that could solve a 1 in a million problem. Why don't I try to solve the biggest problem in the world? And at that time, there was a professor, I believe it's from North Carolina, who was telling everybody, I can prove God doesn't exist. And he would say to people, who's God? And people would say, God is merciful and God is just.
Right.
And he'd say, well, how would God handle a felon, a criminal? If he's merciful, he's got to let him go. If he's just, he's got to punish him. God's not merciful and just. God doesn't exist. So I was like, you know what? Solving this problem, trying to figure out who is God, trying to create a model for God would be the biggest accomplishment ever. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use these 4 principles. I'm going to spend the next 70 years of my life doing this. And then I'm going to hand this off to somebody else and they'll keep doing it. This is going to be a lifelong project. And that's really how this whole model for God started.
And that's who you're in your mid-30s,
Yep.
still 33, 34 at this
33,
point?
34, yeah.
And you're like, okay, the next project is the model for God. And
Right.
yeah, so that didn't take 70 years like you thought it would.
No, it actually didn't take very long because if you use these 4 principles, and I call these 4 principles modeletics. A lot of Christians were talking about apologetics.
Right.
And apology is to make a defense for. So basically what apologetics does is it helps you prove something right, even if it's not. It helps you win an argument. And I figured out modeletics, wouldn't everybody want these? So I named it was modeling techniques, principles that would lead to the truth. So I call them modeletics to kind of make it like apologetics. And I thought, man, everybody's just going to embrace this because everybody really wants to know the truth, right? So I used that and it resulted in this model for God. And so when I wrote the draft for modeling God, I basically started off with those 4 principles. So the first couple of chapters of modeling God share those 4 principles. And then I showed that Jesus taught all 4 of the principles. And the key is to use all 4 principles together. What I noticed is that when I'd watch the History Channel, every time somebody made a mistake in history, I noticed it was because they didn't use at least one of these 4 principles.
Okay.
And so the 4 principles are causality, non-contradiction, comfort mindset, or comfort versus growth. So growth mindset versus comfort, and then contrastive thinking, which is comparative thinking is what everybody's using in apologetics. Contrastive
Right.
thinking is basically you try to prove what's right by proving everything else wrong. So it's the opposite kind of approach. So those four principles, when you use them, it leads you to a model for God.
Yeah, I can speak to this firsthand. Half of my doctorate is apologetics. So I have my doctorate in theology and apologetics. And one of the things that you had helped me see even before I started seminary, and part of I think what you even address in Modeling God right up front is you go to like a theology course these days, whether that's at university or at any school level, and often what you're taught, and from my experience, I can say this is true, is not any principles to help you determine truth, but you're taught what other people say about who God is,
Right.
which is right in the heart of apologetics, right? So now, through my undergrad, through my master's degree, through my doctorate, I can tell you from my experience, most of what I was taught in all of these theology and apologetics courses, what other men and women had said about who God is. And then you just spend the other half of the time learning how to defend what you're being taught in school. And it was very, very rare, if ever, that I was taught tools like what you just presented that are within this model for determining truth, the principles of modeletics, that were meant to give the student the ability to think about things in a way that's different than what the university is telling you. So yeah, like I could speak to that. The whole apologetics thing is very different than the approach modeletics has to information and in the world and at large.
Right. So in Modeling God, like the second chapter, we established the model for God. I don't
Yeah.
hide it because
Right.
in reality, what I do is I give the model for God and then I show how the rest of the doctrine has to not contradict this non-contradictory model for God. So it's really the most of Modeling God is focused on what does that mean the other doctrine are. So God is right and just. Right is a qualitative principle, just is a quantitative principle. They can't contradict because they're qualitative and quantitative. And any other principle you attribute of God that you say is in his nature is either going to contradict or limit the corresponding qualitative or quantitative. So that's it. It's right and just. Now, Moses literally said that. So I don't know
Yep.
why anybody would have a problem with this.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is this is everybody believes their God is right and just.
Yeah, I love this
So if
point.
you I have friends in all the five major religions, and all of them, when I ask them, do you believe your God is unfair or wrong? They're like, no.
I wouldn't believe in
We
them if it
all
did.
believe God is right and just.
Yeah.
So now everything you add to your belief after that fact that contradicts right and just is your religion. That is literally how religions came about. So you have God up here, and then as people, and it's God's right and just, and as people try to go, well, how do we get saved? Well, how do all these things happen? How do you pray? How do you do this? Well, they create something that's contradictory to this. And so now we got this religion. Now we
Yeah.
got this religion. Now we got this religion. I'm not arguing religion. I'm arguing about God.
Right.
And if you think about it, Jesus didn't talk about Christianity. Jesus talked about God. So that's where I'm at. I want to explain God in a non-contradictory way. And then everything else you believe about God has to be consistent with that model, or you need to adjust it. So that's why I don't have a problem talking to people of any religion, because I just ask them questions about how do they resolve this contradiction or that contradiction. And that's how you end it. Now, so the thing is this model for God being right and just. And what I say is God doesn't have a free will, which means God can only do that which is right and just.
Right.
And where this becomes an issue is there's people out there going, I ask people, can God lie? Yeah, God can lie, but he chooses not to. In two places in the Bible, it says it's impossible for God to lie. But here's the problem with saying God can lie. What are the causes within God that can result in him lying? Whatever those
Yeah.
causes are, those would be darkness.
Hmm.
And in 1 John 1, he says, God is light. In him, there's no darkness at all. And that's where no one ever answers that question. I have not had one person when they say, yeah, God can lie, but he chooses not to. And then I ask that question, end the conversation. They don't want to talk because technically they're being blasphemous at that point.
Yeah,
They
I've
are
seen it.
saying God's got some darkness in him.
They are, and I've seen it in multiple cases. I've seen you have interactions. One was on social media with somebody who said, "Yeah, God could lie," because they don't want to. They want to adhere to this doctrine of God being able to do anything, God being all powerful, God being sovereign, with all these flawed definitions for what those terms even mean. But then when you squeeze them with that one question, which is fairly simple. It's using the principle of causality from the model ethics principles, right? And it's like, yeah, I've seen in multiple cases they do not want to answer that second question.
Right. So this model for God, there are four hurdles every model needs to clear. And there are no models that clear all four except for this model for God. So the first two hurdles is basically you got to have consistency within the explanation of his nature. And then you have to have consistency with the attributes that are an effect of that nature. So that's why I've given you right and just as non-contradictory. And then I can show how every effect, how love, how mercy is an effect of right and just in a non-contradictory way. That's where some of these religions, they can't explain. They won't even give that definition and say, well, we can't understand him. So they fail right there. Or when they say God is, omnipotent or omnipotent, he can do anything. I just did the lying thing. Well, how does that correspond to him not being able to lie?
Right.
I don't know. The other two attributes is basically one of them is very famous. It's the problem of evil.
Right.
So if whatever your model for God is, how come there's evil in the world? Is the question basically. And
Right.
so that's where like an omnipotent God, you end up with this idea that either God isn't omnipotent or God doesn't care
Right.
and he's letting evil. But the reality is God rested on the seventh day and made us the first cause. So the first 6 days in the Bible, God was the first cause. He said, let there be light. Why did he say, let there be light?
Yeah. It doesn't say.
We don't know.
Yeah.
It's a first cause. In the Bible, everything after the seventh day, we always get a reason why God does what he does. Every time. He's no longer first cause. He works in response. So that way he can't. So notice God isn't just right and just in what he does. He's right and just in why he does it and how he does it. Never being a first cause, never initiating again allows him, it's impossible for him to be wrong. He's always going to work in response. And then the last hurdle, it's divine immanence and I'm trying to remember that other half of that, transcendence, which is basically when does God get involved? Like, why isn't he always involved? And when does he get involved? He gets involved in response to justice. So if a person has justice for them, God will work for him. If a person has justice against them, even though they're a nice guy and everything, God's working against them. And if they're equal on justice, God doesn't move for them or not move for them. So in the Bible, you can always see why God moved for certain people and didn't move. Even though they might have sinned, he didn't punish them. It's because they had an accumulation of justice. So when you understand that, you have the only model for God that clears all four hurdles.
So, I mean, that it makes sense. It explains not only the difference in just major religions, but it also that same issue with denominations within Christianity is like it's all these different branches off of right and just, and these denominations are just another group of people's explanation for effects that are in some contradiction with right and just.
And that's what they're all doing. They're all trying to resolve some sort of contradiction. Problem is they make a greater contradiction.
By trying to
So
just add to this model that's already simple, right? It's already just stick to this right and just, and don't veer away from God being right and just, and then you can have an explanation for the effects that actually help us.
Right. And that's a key point. You know, the book of Job is really built on the idea that God is right and just, and that justice will occur eventually, just not right in this moment. And Job actually blocked his justice by two things he said. So, you know, the book, I love the book of Job. You love the book of
Yeah.
Job.
Oh
Sometimes
yeah.
we'll just maybe talk about the book of Job because the
Right.
entire Bible's in the book of Job.
Mm-hmm.
God's nature and how God makes things happen is in that one book. And so and that's why people can't seem to explain that book, but people can't seem to explain what's going on. So it causes them to get in a situation like where Job is, where somebody says, you know, I know God's great and all, but in my case, he was wrong and unfair, and I'm dealing with it. And I could put my life aside for 5 years thinking God was wrong and unjust. But when you come to them and explain, here's the model for God, God's right and just. Now, what did you do that got on the wrong side of justice that blocked them from doing this? These people suddenly, you know, are able to bear their own burdens, are suddenly able to grow, and everything
Right.
takes off for them. So understanding the model for God can save people years of their life. And it's like I said, this situation happened to Job. Job didn't understand the model for God, so he was kind of in a hole for a while. And then Elihu came around and it gave him the model for God. And then all of a sudden he went, oh, now I'm out of a hole and God can work for me again. So that's why it's really important to have this model for God.
Yeah, I mean, and I love the book of Job, like you said. It not only explains all that, it also showcases the purpose of the story. You know, we're supposed to extract the meaning from this story, and it also showcases the four principles. If you have them, they can help you interpret this book the right way. And and it also really, one of the things we've seen is the book of Job is the book of the Bible that'll really showcase a person's ability to interpret text.
Right. So like it's a big test. But I like what you just
Yeah.
said about the four principles because that's a huge point. I use the four principles in life to expose contradictions so that I can fix problems.
Right.
When I applied the four principles to the Bible, because there were no contradictions, it exposed truth. And that's really what happened is when I started using these four principles on the Bible, I started understanding the doctrine. You like to say, you know, there's what the Bible says, why in the context, and then the doctrine that runs throughout. That's what happened. The four principles kind of pulled everything away and got to the foundation that runs throughout the Bible. And once I understood that, I'm like, well, I would think that everybody would want to know this. But it all begins with understanding the model for God. And
Right.
after Modeling God came out, I learned some really interesting things. About 2 years after Modeling God came out, I realized how important this model for God was. So basically, in 1962, A.W. Tozer said in one of his books that every time the church goes into eclipse in America, meaning every time the church starts fading, it can't answer the simple question, what is God like? Or basically, what's God's nature?
Right.
And so he was warning us in 62 about that. C.S. Lewis died in November of 63. In the spring of 64, his last book came out, The Discarded Image. And in that book, he said, we need to come up with a capital M model for God that's simple and understandable, but vast in how it covers everything. Right and just is simple and understandable,
Yeah.
and it covers every aspect of God. So there's your answer. But C.S. Lewis was telling us we need to do this or the church is going to fade away. 2 years later, in the cover of Time magazine, is God dead?
Oh.
And if you think about it, atheists know the definition or the nature, God's nature, because atheists go, look, the world's not fair. The world's not
Yeah.
right. God must not exist. That's what they're literally telling us, the model. So now they had to come up with an answer. And they waited 3 years. And in 1969, the church in America created what's known as the Godless Christianity movement. And this was written about in a 2009 article in Newsweek. So 40 years after this, there was an article in 2009, and this 2 years after I published Modeling God, There's a big cross on the cover, and it's like, is it the death of the Christian church in America?
Right.
And in that article, Secular Magazine, they say that the church fell apart in 1969 because they couldn't answer the question of who was God. So they said, we're going to go without an orthodox or correct understanding of God's nature. They're going to focus on Jesus, basically, not focus on God, and say you can't explain who God is. Now, Jesus is fully man, fully God. So now you need two definitions, but they didn't understand that then. The
Right.
problem is ever since 1969, every pastor who's become a pastor since 1969 believes it is wrong to have an explanation for God's nature. And that's why the church is falling apart.
And I grew up in that. That's literally the culture I grew up in. And, you know, just I give God the credit for, you know, intervening in my life when he did, and connecting me with you, so that when I was able to go to seminary, I already had the tools that I needed to be able to interpret what I was being taught in the right way. And I wasn't deceived into thinking that for some reason it's gotten so corrupt that the idea of being able to explain God is now seen as heretical,
Right.
because this picture of God is like he's too big for us to understand. And if you think you can, then you must not think God is big. It's like,
Right.
well, hold on a minute. This whole idea of like right and just is so simple. It makes sense. It makes the rest of the Bible make sense. It makes how do I get saved make sense. All this stuff. So where do we get this omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent? Where do those things come from, if not the Bible?
Right. It came from John Calvin.
All
So
right.
basically, it was a man made doctrine that said, well, I would love to be all these things, so God must be all these things. And it makes sense immediately, but then there's this massive contradiction. If God has figured everything out ahead of time and he's completely in control, why should I have to try to be good? So the Calvinists punish you for not being good and say you don't get any credit for being good because God determined it ahead of time. Well, then what good is your punishment? And that contradictory notion, Calvinism was made into hyper Calvinism by George MacDonald in Scotland in the 1600s. And basically, what happened was for 200 years, hyper Calvinism and John Knox's beliefs really kind of wrecked the church in England and then in the UK. And then this guy, George MacDonald, recognized that in the 1800s, and he decided he was going to figure out a model for God.
So
And
it
he was
was
a scientist. Oh, God.
it was John Knox in Scotland was
Yeah.
like the guy who took Calvinist into hyper Calvinism.
Yes.
And what, like 300 years later or so, you
200
have
years later,
200
20
George
years later,
MacDonald coming in?
George MacDonald.
Okay.
Yeah. George MacDonald said, okay, you know what? This is wrong. This is bad. They're beating kids in school
Hmm.
for not memorizing scriptures because of Calvinism. It's too
But
abusive.
then
So
told
he
they're totally
realized he was a
depraved.
scientist and an engineer, and he was like, I'm going to figure out, who God is. And when he couldn't figure out, and he had two of the principles, he had non-contradictory and causality.
Okay.
And he just couldn't figure it out. When he couldn't figure it out, he decided to write stories that describe or present God's nature.
Yeah.
He ended up influencing Lewis Carroll, J.R.R. Tolkien, and C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis
Oh,
called George MacDonald the master, said that he never wrote anything that didn't reference George MacDonald.
sounds like more people should know who George MacDonald
Right.
is.
Well, he's the greatest Scottish author
All
of
right.
all
Yeah.
time. He's known as wrote the best books and reached the most people
Yeah.
and influenced the most people, and influenced these great authors. C.S. Lewis followed in his footsteps. He tried to figure out the model for God. When he couldn't, he wrote all these stories.
Yeah.
Then what happened was before he died, he said, okay, I got to tell you what I was trying to do the whole time. I was trying to come up with a model for God, and somebody needs to do this. I didn't know I was picking up, his legacy basically. But 2 years
Right.
after I wrote Modeling God, I found out he wrote this in the
Discarded
discarded
image, right?
image. And
I remember
that's why
that.
this is so important. This is so important. But what happened was I got attacked. In
Yeah.
2009, I got attacked by a group of pastors for having a model for God. And basically it upset them because I like to say, they confused being right with righteous. If they're
Yeah.
wrong, they thought they were going to hell. So they started fighting with me, and then they mobbed me. They got hundreds of people to attack me online and attack me in the internet. This is 2009, not knowing the impact of the internet. But by 2010, I had to declare bankruptcy. I couldn't get a job because they had mobbed me so bad. Nobody wanted to hire me to have this controversy.
So
And
what's
some of the
mobbed?
things they did was so outrageous. It's amazing, like, to tell that story.
What is this mob? Can you explain what being mobbed is little bit
So
more?
bullying might be what I do to you, but mobbing,
Okay.
the way mobbing works is I go get a group of people riled up to
Uh,
attack you. You fight all the people that are attacking you, but I'm the source. There's never going to be an end to the people behind you. So this is, the term is mobbing, and it's a fairly new concept. I didn't know about mobbing back then. I don't even think people talked about it, but there's a lot in the literature now about how mobbing works, and this is really what destroys people. So it's one person
yeah. Okay.
organizing a group of people to attack. You handle all the people attacking you, but you never get to the source who's underlying doing all that.
Right.
So yeah, so that's
Okay.
what I did. I got mobbed,
Hmm.
and the story is outrageous, and we'll certainly talk about it some other time.
Oh, yeah.
However, when people heard about the story, they would want to do a documentary, and I kept saying no, 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 and I kept saying no. Well, as you know, a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, you and Jonathan started getting attacked by pastors for the things that I had said,
Right.
and these pastors hadn't realized what had happened to the other pastors. And so when I backed them down, a documentarian came to me and said, "Hey, I heard this story about you. I'd like to do your story." I said, "Maybe it's time to do it." So I agreed to do it. I'm not a producer. I don't get any money from it, but I told my story. The documentarian has really done a good job working through this and talking to people. I think it's going to be out in 2025. And the title of it is Heretic, the Man Who Modeled God. And we know a heretic is someone who believes something different than the majority. Doesn't mean you're
Right.
good or bad. And, Jesus was a heretic.
He
The
was.
problem
Yeah.
is most heretics get killed, and then 20, 30 years, 40 years after they're dead, people embrace their idea and move on. So it
Yeah.
takes us some time. I'm fortunate enough to live long enough to see, this catch on with people. But
Right.
that's kind of what happened. There was a group of people that attacked me, and now the documentarian contacted about 200 of these people who went online, 16 years ago, right up to last month. I mean, there's been people attacking me all the way through for the last 16 years to last month even,
Yep.
and asked these people, "Will you be on the documentary to say something?" Zero
None
people.
of them.
Nobody will. One of the two guys who wrote the original letter admitted it never should have been written, which is amazing.
Yeah.
But
Good for
everybody
him.
else wants to pretend like it never happened. And the reason is that in those last 16 years, people have gotten so much help with their mental and emotional health through this information from the Bible that basically what happens is there are people out there, when they see the documentary, are going to realize my uncle who died 6 years ago, who killed himself, could have been helped by this, having this information. Why did he get it again? Who's the people who stopped this? I want to go find those
Yeah.
people. Well, nobody wants to say they're the ones who stopped this because they realize what they did is wrong. But only one out of 200 people has confessed and repented for it. The other 99, 199 plus want to pretend like it never
It
happened.
also just kind of brings more of the severity behind being mobbed because there's so many people who weren't the origin of the story. The mob themselves are being deceived into this whole thing.
Right.
They don't even know. Because I know a lot of the people that I've dealt with who've attacked you and then me, adjacent to you, are people who they literally don't know the origin of the story. And this thing has been warped into, for somehow you being the instigator of all the trouble that's happened. So like I can see like mobbing is exponentially worse of an issue than just bullying one person to one person.
Yeah. What's amazing is only one guy read the book. He misinterpreted it and got a crowd to attack me. And so
Yeah.
even modern day Christians can't even think for themselves. The number of pastors who said, I won't read that book because I'm afraid I'll get deceived. They're a pastor and they don't trust their own ability to read a book and determine what's true or what's not.
And I like to say, in a book that's easier to read and interpret than the Bible,
Right, right.
right?
That's a great point. I used to
Which
always
is
say,
their
wait a minute,
job.
you can't interpret this book, but you think you can interpret the Bible. The Bible's
Yeah,
much tougher than this.
yeah.
So yeah, I'm sure we'll talk a lot
Oh
about that.
yeah, we should do a whole episode on that whole
Yeah,
arc.
one of the things that happened with me with the problem solving tools with Modeletics is I got in charge of a company. I was running a company. I was using these principles and they weren't working on people.
Oh,
And it was interesting. It's like these tools are the ultimate problem solving tools.
okay.
But when you solve a person's problem, you create three more problems for them. It's called the law of unintended consequences. And your solution, the overall stress from your solution is worse than from the original problem. And that's when I learned how to dissolve problems. What I learned was basically how to look at the intangible cause. And then when I went back to the Bible, I realized God never solved a problem in the Bible. God always dissolved problems. So that's one of the ways to know if a person's really hearing from God or not. If their approach to a problem is solve, that's a human focus. If their approach to a problem is dissolve, like what Solomon did with the babies, with the one baby and the two women, was a dissolve, not a solve. So that's one of the measures I learned. And then that's what helped me deal with people and helped me do all this, because I created a model for the mind and brain based off the information from the Bible. So when I used the four principles on the Bible, what happened was I realized God showed us that we have a mind or a soul. If you know who you are as a mind or a soul. In the Bible, when God is looking at the earth, it's his mind. When God is looking in the heavenly, it's his soul. When
Okay.
you are looking to the heavenlies, you're a soul. When you're looking to the earth, you're a mind. Mind and soul is the same thing. You have an intangible uniqueness. And, it's basically Romans 12, these seven, they're called motivational spiritual gifts. That everybody has one, whether you believe or not. God gave them to
Right.
everybody. So that's your uniqueness. And then the way God designed the brain is all throughout the Bible. And I'm sure we'll cover some of that. But when I got this model for the mind and brain from the Bible, I took the Bible and the God and the Jesus out of it, and I went into the school system and I started helping the schools. I started helping teachers finish the school year with more energy than they began the school year.
And
I
these were
started
like EBD teachers, like the
well, all
teachers.
teachers, yeah, but these EBD teachers, they don't last. The middle school EBD teachers, for example, don't last more than 5 years.
That's emotional behavioral disorder. So they're the ones who are teaching the kids who are the ones who have the biggest behavioral issues,
Right.
right?
So
So the
I was
teachers
helping.
with the biggest burden.
Yeah, they have the biggest burden. They get worn out. Those people
Yeah.
started loving their job. And I like to say, why did they become teachers? For the money? No, because they said this was the job they loved. And why are they burnt out at the end of the year?
Oh, good question.
Because they don't know how to run their mind and their brain. But what happened was when they learned these tools, first of all, they applied it to themselves. Then when they learned them, they were instantly able to help every kid. And so we got kids out of special education back into regular education. Because when you look at a kid or another person, and when God looks at us, he looks at your uniqueness, and then he looks at what thought process you're in. Then he knows what to do. And I say people have all these tools. Their tools are in piles. When they handle an issue, they go to a pile, they pick a tool. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. When you understand step one, step two, it's like creating this wall storage unit for all your tools. You assess the situation, step one, step two, you go to that part of the wall storage unit and pick any one of your tools, and it will work 100% of the time.
Yeah.
So now this information is helping people outside of the church in a sense, still God's information, but it's helping them. But the thing is if you think about it, I have a model for God. This would help so many people in so many countries. I've been attacked for it. I have a model for the mind and brain. The issue with people, religious people, is not their religious doctrine. It's them. And I was in an interview with a Muslim woman,
Okay.
And she was starting to argue with me about, you know, the Quran and what these people are doing. And I made the point to her, does the Quran say to do that? Are Muslims supposed to do that? Then where's the real issue? It's in the
With people.
individual.
Yeah.
So I told her, I said, just so you know, I'm the one on this interview defending the Quran and Islam.
Right. Right.
You're the one attacking it. The reason you're missing it is because it's the person, it's not the belief system.
Right.
And if we understood how people work, mind and brain, we wouldn't have these issues. There's one guy who has a non-contradictory model for the mind and brain. Why aren't we listening to that guy either? Now we're going to attack him. So to me, I sleep really well at night.
Yeah.
And for the last 15 years, I haven't woken up one time wondering if I'm wasting my life. And I know I'm going to go through eternity being the man who modeled God. So I'm fine with that. And the people who truly are hearing from God and truly want to help people, whether it's mentally, emotionally, or whether it's spiritually, I know that they continue to talk to me. People who are fakers and hypocrites, they might talk to me once and then they just will never talk to me again because they can't handle the truth. They know this is the answer and they really want to spend their life looking for the answer and think they're good people. They don't really ever want to find the answer.
So the model for God, the model for the mind and the brain. Like, why you, John?
You know, there's one more attribute I think I should explain here. And
Okay.
this has been with me from the start. So when I got out of college, I had, I worked on these principles of model ethics and everything. And I had this philosophy and science kind of background. But I seem to always approach a problem the opposite way.
Hmm.
It always upset people. And I could never explain what I'm doing, but I just called it the opposite approach.
Okay.
So in all those companies, when I dissolved these problems that no one else could solve, I started off in the opposite way. And it wasn't until later that I found out that that term is synthesis.
Okay.
So the way
Yeah.
everybody naturally, our brains naturally work according to analysis. Our brains naturally look at something and break it into pieces.
Yeah.
So
Classic.
there you go.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if you think about it, the problem is there's a 2019, I believe it's 2019 article in the Harvard Business Review that explains that this is called categorical thinking
Oh.
and that our brain instantly does it. So if you line up a bunch of people according to skin color, our brain goes, boom. Everybody here's black, everybody here's white. Even though the two people next to each other don't
Right.
look
Look the
different,
same, right? Yeah.
you artificially create two categories.
just
You
naturally
make them a lot
happens?
more different than they are. You have assumptions about them and you don't, you lock them in. Analysis, which our brain naturally does, is why we are naturally racist and sexist.
It's categorical thinking.
So this
Okay.
approach that everybody in the world is taking, which is solve, is the reason why we have racism and sexism. So if everybody wants to keep embracing that instead of the approach that I've learned, then that's on them. That's why the world gets worse. The reason the world gets worse is we solve problems through analysis.
Yeah.
I take a backward step all the time. It's called synthesis. And that's how you dissolve problems. And that's how God did it. And in fact, I didn't know this term synthesis. I only learned this term synthesis 3 years ago. But, 18 years ago when I wrote Modeling God, the first analogy in Modeling God was synthesis. The only way I could describe
Right.
what I'm doing is different than everybody else is I said this. I said, imagine there's a wall that's 200 miles wide and 50 miles high. And you're standing, basically within arm's reach of a 200 foot by 200 foot tile that's red. You think this entire wall is red.
It's a red wall. Yeah.
And what most people want to do is go, I'll understand the wall. And they walk towards
What's
the
it
wall
made
and they
of?
etch the wall and they
Yep.
get in there and they go, I know the whole wall because I know this.
Yep.
And I said, really, you should back away from the wall. When you back away from the wall, you realize I'm just looking at a tile. There's another tile over here that's blue. Well, maybe I should back further away. So you back further away from the wall and people start talking about a fish. out of water and you start going,
Yeah.
oh, maybe we're like a fish out of water. And you back away. And there's a certain point where you back away where it's the tiles are a jumbly mess. And the reason I got this analogy is I was flying into an airport in Oklahoma and I was walking through, to leave. And on the wall was a mural. And I noticed like I was a distance where I'm like, what is that? And when I went further away on the hall, it was a cowboy riding a bronco pony, a
Okay.
horse. And then I walked towards it and it just was all these. And then if I got close enough, it's just a tile. It's just a bunch of tiles. But
Right.
halfway, it's like, I'm getting a headache. And that's where they get to this place where it's just a jumbly mess. They get a headache and they go back towards the wall. You get further from the wall, I say, and then you see it's a man teaching another man to fish. And that's why people mention the fish out of water thing. If you back all the way away from the wall and you see the entire wall, now you can go forward analysis and explain the tiles relative to the picture. So the first step should always be to back all the way out of the wall. That should always be the first step. So my first step is always synthesis. I always go the opposite way. Everybody, I call it A to B. Everybody tries to immediately solve the problem.
Yep.
And what I do is I just go backwards until I get all the information. I see the whole picture. And then I do analysis. And then I have the answer.
Right.
And the answer applies to all the context versus when you just solve a person's problem. It fits one context. There's only 4 contexts. And the other 3 contexts, there's a problem in it. That's why we create 3 more problems. So if you think about it, dissolve occurs because you go to synthesis first. Your first step is back. And if your first step is back, that's how God thinks.
Right.
So ultimately, if I were to wrap this all up, I'm a systems thinker, and more importantly, I'm a synthesis systems thinker. I believe I'm the only synthesis systems thinker living today because there was a guy, Dr. Russell Ackoff, who was a synthesis systems thinker. He'd have been 101 or 102 right now. He died when he was 90. And he spent 16 years of his life trying to determine the biggest system because his thought was this. If you understand, he thought the small system was science, which is these 4 principles, by the way.
Right.
And he
Right.
thought the biggest system was God. And he spent 16 years of his life trying to model God because he said, if you can model the biggest system, synthesis, go to bigger systems, then you could understand everything all the way down. And so he's trying to do that. So his definition of a system was a whole, W-H-O-L-E, that consists of 2 or more essential parts. So everything's a system. Your car is a system, and it has a unique property. That property, like a car, is transportation. None of the parts can do the property by themselves. The engine can't even transport itself. So everything's a system. We need to see everything as a system and not see things isolated. God sees everything as a system. The issue is God is not the biggest system. Technically, God's the smallest system. Right and just is the smallest system. And I learned all this from my mentor, who is this guy who really understood another person, Deming. But he met Ackoff, knew Ackoff closely. His daughter knew Ackoff really well, the whole family and everything. And Ackoff used to take questions at the end of his talks. And he got me private tapes of Ackoff's talks where I saw
That's so cool.
what he was trying to work out here. And so I said to my mentor, I said, if I could have asked Ackoff one question, this is what it would have been. I would have said to him, I have a question, but first I want to understand something. You say a system is a whole made up of 2 or more essential parts. That implies that a system is a created thing. And my mentor said, yeah. He would say, yeah, because you have to have the parts before you have the whole.
Yeah.
I said, so wouldn't that make, so here's my question, wouldn't that make the only thing in the universe that's not a system the creator? And my mentor went, no one ever asked him that. And I told my mentor, I said, I'd like to believe Ackoff said, what's your telephone number? I want to have lunch with you.
Yeah.
And so that's like really my ultimate proof. Right and just is whole. It's qualitative and quantitative. It's really, if you think about it, if you look at a ball from 2 different points of view, it's the same ball. Sometimes we look at things qualitatively, sometimes we look at it quantitatively, but it's a whole. So God is a whole. He's the creator. He's not a system. And everything he creates is a system. And the biggest system is God's will. So Akoff had it wrong. God is the smallest system. And the biggest system is God's will. God's plan is what he's trying to accomplish. God's will is how he goes about it. So if you think about it, God's will is bigger than God's plan. And my analogy is if you watch a movie, within the first 10 minutes, you know the plan. This group is going to rob this bank. That's the plan.
Yep. Yep.
The will is the next 150 minutes of how they do it. You know, they try to do this and this goes wrong and they have to adjust. And this bad thing happens, but it ends up being a good thing. And this good thing happens, that ends up being a bad thing. And this person stops them, that ends up
It's
being
every
a good
heist
thing.
movie.
This person helps them, that ends up being a bad thing. It's like,
Yeah.
that's God's will, how God is trying to do his plan. And if you read the entire Bible as a story and step way away from the wall is God's will. The entire Bible is trying to show you how God brings about his plan so you can be a part of it. And if you understand how he does it and you approach everything in your life that way, so your relationship with your kids, your relationship in your marriage, business, every area of your life, you will be able to dissolve every problem. So when people talk to me and ask me my opinion, I'm always going to be looking at synthesis from God's will. I'm going to be trying to dissolve it, and I'm going to understand how the mind and brain works and that there's people involved, not robots, but people. And that's how I approach everything.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So I love this. The idea of God's plan is pretty much given away right from the start.
Right.
But the complexity comes with how does this
Well,
plan get
Eden was his
executed,
plan.
right?
That's how the Bible ends.
Right.
Eden. It's a
It's funny.
garden. There's a man. There's a woman. There's God. Tree of
I love
life.
the movie analogy because honestly, you think about it, it's like half the time, even the trailer gives away the plan.
Right.
You didn't even start watching the movie yet. You
Right.
already know the plan before you go see the movie. And watching the movie is about watching how are they going to pull this off.
Right.
And if you know all that with God, if you know, I love that. If you know how God's will happens, then everything is underneath, is a smaller system underneath that. So that's great. And I mean, so far the books that are published, you have Modeling God, Modeling God's Wills, and there will be Modeling God's Plan. But right now, the two books you've published are already like, here's the smallest system, here's the largest system.
And then here's how paradise works, which people have written about that too. So
right, yeah, a lot of, and usually it's in the sci-fi genre because people can't nail it down, so they have to do it through stories, and even then, it's usually missed. So, well, I appreciate it. There's clearly so much for us to talk about more. I appreciate this great starting point with you, though, John, and yeah, we'll definitely have you on frequently in the future. So, thank you.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, have a great day.
You too.
All right. Wow. What a great interview, right? So now's the time where I get to do my thing and dig into the story a little bit. Let's dig into some of the underlying truths, some of the behind the scenes stuff, and some stuff that, I want to elaborate on after now talking with John for almost an hour. So very early on in my walk with God, I had an interaction with a leader in the church. I was very passionate about what I was learning. John had taught me the model for God. I had read Modeling God, and I wanted everybody to know that God was right and just. And I had an interaction with a leader in the church, somebody who had been leading in the church for decades. Again, remember, I'm walking with God for maybe 6 months at this point. And I was telling this leader who I believe God was and defining his nature. And this leader told me, there's no way you can know God as well as you're saying you can. God's too big to understand. If he was big enough to understand, or if he was small enough to understand, he wouldn't be big enough to worship. One of those, platitudinal lines that really just is deceiving. Well, anyways, yeah, that interaction really, really hit me hard. This leader ended up saying, my grandpa, even on his deathbed, wouldn't have been able to say he knows God as well as you do. Which, looking back on it now, it's unfortunate for her grandpa. It's unfortunate for her. And I'll tell you, if I didn't have the community around me that I did, that could have been a turning point in my walk with God. That could have been the thing that caused me to just stray from the path. But I did have a few really strong believers and mature Christians with me who were able to help me understand that no, God does want to be known. And in fact, in Jeremiah, we're taught that the only thing we should glory in is that we understand and know God and that we know who he is and how he works. So now I look back and that was a great interaction, but it was just a taste of what I was able to see that would happen more and more as I interacted with John, as I continued to learn the model for God and the model for God's will. And the more I interacted with pastors and leaders in the church. It was unfortunate, but that was not an isolated incident. Now, another thing that I wanted to touch on that was briefly mentioned in John's story, I had talked about, going to seminary. And now I had learned the model for God and read Modeling God long before I went to seminary. So I had this model. I had the model for God. I had the model for salvation. Then I went to seminary. I went to my undergraduate and I double majored both in religion and in education. And I graduated with honors in both majors. Then I got my master's degree in theological studies. And then as of recently, as of just like within the last 6 months, I got my doctorate. And I graduated with straight A's for my doctorate. Like my overall percentage average was like high 98%, almost 99 percentile over my entire doctorate degree. And now, although that may sound like I'm bragging, my point isn't to talk about how smart I am. My point is to emphasize the power of the information in modeling God and modeling God's wills, and also the information that John teaches about the model for the mind and the brain. This information is what helped me excel at university, at seminary, in graduate school, getting my doctorate. One of the things I actually said, there were assignments that I would have to write at a lesser level of complexity than what I'm used to, than what I teach at church even. And not complexity isn't, I shouldn't have said complexity, a lesser depth, a more abstract level and less deep. Because you get deep doesn't mean you get more complex necessarily. A lot of the information that I'm teaching at church is very simple. It's deeper than what you hear. And that's what going to seminary and my doctorate in particular was like. The stuff that we are learning at the church that I'm pastoring and the stuff that I learned in Modeling God back in 2006, 2007, before it was even published, when I read it in manuscript form, was ahead of where I was even in my doctorate just over this last year. So I would have to be more abstract with my assignments at the doctorate level at university than I would preaching a sermon on a Sunday morning at my church here in northeastern Wisconsin. So that's, again, to show you the power of this information. It makes everything about God and salvation and his will make sense. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't mean I know everything. I mean, these models help you understand the things that you're dealing with in every context. Another thing I wanted to address, John talked about God being the smallest system. I can already feel people getting uncomfortable at him saying that. And it's something that we address in Modeling God's Wills, the second edition of this trilogy that him and I are co-authoring. Well, he's authoring and I'm commentating. Let's be real. So I like to make sure people know when John says God's the smallest system, he's not saying God is small. Okay. Just as a system thinker, to say God is the smallest system means really it's because he's not a system. Because remember, a system is a whole made up of two or more essential parts. God doesn't have any parts. God the Father, the Creator, right and just. And remember, qualitative and quantitative. Another way to look at it is God is holy. Holy is the causes of holy are right and just. So those are two parts of the same whole, right? So they're not really parts. It depends on whether or not you're looking at it quantitatively or qualitatively. So God is one. He's one part. Therefore, he's not a system. That part, though, is the cause, the first cause. So again, God being the smallest system does not mean God is small. Then finally, I wanted to just go through some of the biblical support for God's nature, because John did refer to Moses' teaching that God's nature was right and just. One of my favorite verses in all of Scripture is Deuteronomy 32:4. And it says this: the rock, his work is perfect, for all his ways are justice, a God of faithfulness and without iniquity, just and right is he. There you go, right there. Moses summarizes God by saying just and right is he. Then finally, one of the Psalms, Psalm 89:14, does another really good job of describing God's nature. This one says, righteousness and justice are the foundation of thy throne. Loving kindness and truth go before thy faith. Go before thy face. What I love about this is not only do we see righteousness and justice right there, but it says righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne. So the throne is the seat upon which God makes all of his decisions. What is the foundation, or what is guiding every decision God makes? Righteousness and justice. God's nature is right and just. John did not invent that. The Bible declares it, and it is true. So that's it for today on Unlocked. I'm Dr. Joel Swakowski. You can find John Lenhart at modelinggod.com or at the handle at modelinggod at both Twitter, X, and at modelinggod at Instagram as well. So go check out those resources. Keep learning from John's journey. He's got a ton of stuff that you can look at in any of those areas. But thank you for listening. Keep seeking truth. Keep living it out. And we'll see you next time.